Much of the time with a windbreaker on, rain jacket, something, and I see people and we kind of glare at each other. But this past week it's been altogether different. We have enjoyed a thumbs up for the weather, bright day, makes one feel a little bit better in difficult times. Pardon? Yeah. Well, good to see all of you here. Last week, those of you who were able to come, know we met in the sanctuary because we as a congregation were honoring Carol Harker in here. And I know many of you were directly involved in that and couldn't be there, and that's fine. I think Carol was the priority lesson, rightly so. As you remember, I have a thesis here. And the thesis is that about the faithful middle, Lutheran theology in a polarized extremist world. And I have a confession to make. When I first started pondering this, I am of a particular age, as some of you are as well, in the early 1960s. 1964, to be precise. When Barry Goldwater said and ran on the idea that the extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. If my memory serves me, there was another line behind that. Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. And he lost, by the way, and Lyndon Johnson and his campaign immediately in our good old black and white television set, I remember, had a mushroom cloud. Okay. And the girl with the daisy. Yes, right. Well, there are some virtues of being old enough to remember some of these kinds of things. But that idea has been boiling around in my mind for a long time, thinking about this middle. And I told you 2 weeks ago that I really wanted to entitle this course, The Radical Middle. And I'm not really prepared to abandon that term, even though I thought maybe faithful would appeal to, us Lutheran middle-class folks a little bit more. But it also is a reminder in terms of the way we think about Lutheran theology, the way we think about faithfulness, the way we think about being in the middle in light of circumstances of the last week or 10 days in a city where we lived for some time. Some of you have as well. The Twin Cities, in particular Minneapolis and St. Paul. And how we think about this business of probing to a kind of theological vision that represents values that we as people of faith in the Christian community want to see those values informing how we deal with difficult, chaotic, troubling times in a, shall we say, faithful way. I also mentioned 2 weeks ago that I think we often, and rightly so, in this tradition, gravitate to the gospel narratives where Jesus says, "Come follow me," and then try to see what that might mean as it plays itself out in the various gospel narratives. I think that's great. But I also think it is important for us as individuals and as communities of faith, to think on another level about theological reflection. And as I've said before, I think theology, the term itself, has often come to be disused because it seems to be off-putting to people as compared to the New Testament narratives about Jesus. But many of the things that we need to think about require us to move to that other level as well. Not to abandon the stories and the narratives of the Gospels in the New Testament, but to think about some of these theological, and I don't want to say concepts, but dynamics at play 500 years ago, 1,500 years ago in the history of the church. And hence, how we think about the relationship between certain things. And last week, we talked about law and gospel. Law and gospel. Now, just spend a little bit of time by way of review. If we go to either extreme on this issue of law and gospel, we can end up on one extreme with legalism. Legalism, generally, in religious communities, I'm going to say generally, and I'll generalize here, has been a religion of do's and don'ts, expectations. You shouldn't, if you're a young girl, wear lipstick, and by heaven's name, don't play cards. You know, it ends up in a kind of legalism that I personally didn't experience, but I know many people who did. I know many people who have abandoned Christianity, who abandoned the church because they could never get beyond the legalism of religion that they had experienced. And this is Protestant and Catholic. On the other hand, what if we abandon any sense of law, abandon any sense of expectation and accountability and so on and so forth, and we go to the extreme on that end? We end up with what theologians, maybe even Dietrich Bonhoeffer himself, said is cheap grace. Cheap grace. Oh, we just all love each other? I mean, no, maybe I don't know. Maybe it's San Francisco in 1968. I'm not sure. So in any way, somewhere in that continuum, somewhere in that middle, we want to think, I think, about how we hold together, adjudicate, maybe move the slide rule one way or another to hold law and gospel, expectation, accountability, mercy, grace, and all those things in some sort of continuum, some sort of way together. Are you with me here? Again, this we talked last time about this. Those of you who were here. The second one on this sheet, or third, I guess it is, saint and sinner. Saint and sinner. I'm not going to read Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 5, verses 12 to 21, the Adam and Christ typology, what Adam brought into the world, Christ presented just the opposite. some have read in that St. Augustine was one, and others. And by the way, remember, 1,000 years after St. Augustine, Luther was an Augustinian monk. And they saw in that Romans 5 text a notion of original sin. You don't come into the world sort of as a blank slate. You come into the world sinful, as a sinner, embroiled in sin. Therefore, you need to be redeemed. I've never bought that idea in Romans as coming out of Romans 5. I don't think, and this is a slightly different angle on it, I don't think this business of sinner and saint is sequential. I once was lost, but now am found. I'd sing it to you if I could, but you'd prefer that I not. It's not sequential. If it is, I think we're in a lot more trouble than I thought we were. Because there will be people who think through some sort of conversion, they move from being sinners to being saints, and Lord help us. It's existential. Luther would talk about simul justus et peccator, simultaneously justified and sinful. It is all bound up at the same time. Now, it may be that we as individuals and as communities vacillate and we move the slide rule along there in some way, and so on and so forth. But we are not. Just a bunch of saints in the particular sense, even though we are in the communion of saints. But that's not necessarily the same thing as perfection. And the third thing in that set last time that we tried to think about was freedom of the will and the bondage of the will. As I said last time, and I'll repeat again, we Americans have a problem with the word freedom. We are now, this year, celebrating the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. A few years later, we're going to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Constitution. I think it's a lack of imagination on my part, but last year and this year and maybe next year too, I'm devoting some of my reading time to the business of the American Revolution and the American Constitution. Just as an attempt to be an informed citizen. Most of what I have read and learned, I already learned sometime before, but the beauty of age is you forget a lot of things. And I couldn't tell you what all 10 of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution really are. I know the first one and the second, but beyond that, I'm in trouble. So, if we go back 250 years, our notion of freedom was freedom from taxation without representation, freedom from the control of King George III, and so on. It was freedom from something. And I think that notion of freedom has woven itself through American history ever since. Now, there are things about that I want to affirm. There are things we should be free from. There are personal things we may want to be free from. Addiction, substance abuse, that we're tyrannized by and not in control of. I would affirm all of that. But that's not how St. Paul thought about freedom. He thought about freedom from something, perhaps freedom from bondage to sin, so we could be free for something. The ancients in the early period of the church never thought about absolute freedom. They understood they were in bondage. They lived in a society that was probably made up of a third of the people being enslaved in one form or another, maybe another third, as many as another third, who were manumitted, or ex-slaves, and a third, roughly, who were citizens of the empire. Slavery was endemic, and I don't think Paul, for example, ever thought of being free from anything that might control you, and he thought, I think, quite vigorously about freedom for something. Along comes Martin Luther in the 16th century, and in an essay, The Freedom of a Christian, has a beautiful line, reflecting Paul in his own language. A Christian is a perfectly free Lord of all, subject to none, and a perfectly dutiful servant of all, subject to all. I think in the Christian community we've struggled to try to hold these two things together, sometimes more successfully than at other times. But we have been set free to be responsible, which challenges us to try to figure out how that might represent itself. Let me pause here. That's sort of review, I think, to bring everybody back into a frame of reference here. But 2 weeks ago, at the end, we had some really insightful questions or observations, because part of this is, I think the questions are as important as the answers, about how do we define extremism? What is it? How would we know it if we saw it? Is it all a matter of questions and there's nothing here that we can hold on to, really, because everything is in flux and in play? Important. How is the public perception of extremism sometimes applied to religious communities? And how do we as individuals sort of think our way and negotiate our lives through this whole thing? And if you have other observations or questions before we go on, I am more than eager to take the time to entertain those. No, there you go.
Got it. So I'm just wondering, maybe it's whether you've thought about how what you're talking about the law here, and when we had the discussion that Pastor Allison led about the law of the world versus the role of the church.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah. If we were to go back to St. Paul, he thought, as did Jews in his day and before, about different notions of law. Let's think about some Jewish notions of law in the ancient world. There was I put a fancy term on it, apodictic law, the Ten Commandments, these general principles. Then there was casuistic law, case law. Well, you might not murder somebody, but you might kill somebody. How are different cases different and punishments different? And then there was the ceremonial law, Leviticus. We could go through Leviticus. That would charm everybody. Then we could look at St. Paul. He struggled as a Jew and a follower of Christ to figure out how to understand the law. And one of the things he came up with, the law was a custodian, a pedagogos is the Greek word, until Christ came. The law governed until Christ came. It was temporary. Most Jews wouldn't buy that necessarily, but there was a second use of the law for Paul, and that was the law can drive us to an awareness of our own sinfulness, our own inadequacy. Okay, go on another 1,500 years to Luther. He's going to distinguish the law in a somewhat different way. There is civic law. That's the law of the state. And it is here that the law functions to make social life possible. But he also thought that the law, probably consistent with Paul, could make us aware of our own sinfulness. And then there's the third use of the law, which it's really debated as to whether Luther ever said or thought this, but Lutheranism certainly did. The law is a guide about to lead us and guide us in appropriate behavior in the Christian community. Moral law, if you will, that guides us and keeps us from maybe our own worst instincts. Well, that's 500 years ago. So I think it's fair to say, Tom, that we want to affirm as citizens of any society, any nation, the necessity of just laws to govern our common life. But we also know that those laws need to be interpreted. Any text needs to be interpreted. Our Constitution, for example, is invariably interpreted. I've read two books. One by Jack Rakoff, who is a historian. He's not a lawyer. He's a historian at Stanford who wrote a book entitled Original Meanings. And he's taking to task this idea of the Supreme Court affirming only original intent. He says, hold on here, folks. Where are you going to find original intent? Is it in the minds of the writers of the Constitution? Well, they didn't all agree with each other. Or is it just going to be in the text? The text, as the Constitution is written, generates different meaning possibilities. It isn't just clear right down to every jot and tittle. It couldn't be. The world has changed. We come to it differently. And then he says, if you really want to open that Pandora's box, go to the states, the colonies, and look at the record of how they debated whether they were going to vote for accepting this as a constitution or not. They were all over the map about what they thought the text meant. So he says, Jack Rakoff that is, well, we've got original meanings here. And that didn't stop after the Constitution was ratified. It's been going on through judicial reinterpretation for going on the better part of 250 years. The other one, written by Jill Lepore, a Harvard, she's in the law school at Harvard, but a historian. She laments the decline of the whole process of amendment. It's so difficult to amend the Constitution, and in a polarized world, it is doubly difficult to amend it. And if you look at the history of amendments, they burst on the scene at strategic points, and then there's this arid wasteland in between. Okay, now, you could say many of the same things about biblical interpretation. There's a great deal of difference. Now, I'm not sure where I was going with all this, but it's a struggle to figure out meaning. It's a struggle to figure out how we think about law more generally. The one thing I will say, I think we can. Keep it out of here. Okay. I figured that if you heard it once, the echo, maybe we'd make progress, but it doesn't work that way, does it? One thing that I think is historically and theologically problematic for Christians on the law-gospel issue is to say the law is in the Old Testament, the gospel's in the New Testament. That's factually incorrect, exegetically, interpretively incorrect, and even perhaps worse, it is one of the streams that feeds into anti-Judaism. Okay? Now, but this business then of being simultaneously saint and sinner, sinner and saint, again, is not sequential. And freedom. I think we have to think long and hard about that, okay? So what I'd like to do today, or for the remainder of today, is look at Roman numerals 5, 6, and 7 as a set, if we can. Roman numeral 5. Again, the fancy word that I'm wanting to think about is providence. And it's not a hospital up here. Providence is thinking about God active in the world. And I'll give him credit. A friend of mine, a friend of ours actually, Scottish friend, in graduate school, he was a theologian. I was more of a historian, biblical scholar, exegete, and so on and so forth. But David Ferguson, who has subsequently, he really arrived. He's been a Regius Professor at Cambridge University for a number of years, and before that at Edinburgh. That you get appointed to that position by the king or the queen. And he wrote a massive tome on providence, how God works in the world. Now, there are extremes here. God controls everything. God controls nothing. And I must say, the whole question of providence is one of the most mystifying for me. I know, maybe you have known people who have a notion of providence that is pretty much over here. God controls pretty much everything, and there's a plan for your life. And you're just here to show how it unfolds. In the most extreme version, it's kind of fatalistic, it seems to me. It comes back and intersects with the whole question of freedom, etc. As we know, there are people who are not theists who are quite sure there is no higher power, divine being controlling anything, because there isn't one. We're on our own, folks. But there are also, in the founding of this country, deists who use the image of the divine watchmaker, got the thing going, and then went on vacation. It just plays itself out. So this idea that all of our founders were these faithful Orthodox Christians isn't exactly true. I don't think this country even becomes largely Christian. And I don't mean a Christian nation, but people, until we have the first and second Great Awakenings. People went to church and they were escaping stuff in Europe and England and so on and so forth, but they weren't necessarily what we would think just kind of regular, ordinary, pew-sitting folks. So, how do we think about this? I told you, I'm mystified. It affects how we pray, I think. Intercessory prayer, people who are ill, we pray for their healing and so on and so forth. Sometimes they're healed, sometimes they're not. At least in our frame of reference. There is a problem, it seems to me, a theological problem, if we have a very high notion of divine providence. God is in control of things. I don't mean he, she, or she. He is in control of things. Patriarchal stuff. Yeah. There is a problem. There's a theological problem because it raises a second question. What about the justice of God? What about the justice of God? How is it that this God who controls everything or so much would allow that child to get cancer and suffer a long time in life, or maybe not survive it at all early on, how can a just, merciful, and gracious God do that? Again, the fancy word is the theodicy question, the righteousness, justice of God. On the other extreme, there have been theologians in my lifetime who wanted to argue for something called process theology. That God isn't all-powerful, God isn't, the omni-God, all-powerful, all-knowing, etc., etc. God is just the most powerful. They're trying to avoid the issue of the injustice of God, and they're trying to think through how it is that we can still be theists, be faithful in this middle ground. Are you with me so far here? How we construe this. We could probably not only here, but we can go to probably almost any Christian worship service, and the proclamation and the liturgy, the liturgical representation, however it is shaped, will suggest that God's right here, loving us all day in and day out. I too want to affirm that. But I want for myself to recognize the other side of the coin. If we assume the more fatalistic position, what does that do to our individual and collective lives here in this world today? It breeds a kind of quietism. Why bother working for this noble cause or that one? What does a responsible life look like? Well, God's in control. That's it, folks. Stay at home, put your feet up, and turn the TV on again. Watch a Survivor episode or something. I think we Lutherans have often been a little too much on that side, historically. Sometimes the Lutheran Church has been described as the Republican Party at prayer. It's not diminishing Republicans, it's not glorifying Democrats or independents, it's simply referring to this business, Pat, of quietism. Quietism. Yeah. I think I think we still use it. The tagline, God's work, our hands, for the ELCA. I still kind of like that. We do have responsibilities. And I think Pastor Allison did a good job when you think about gratitude and stewardship and all that today, to think about how we think about reflecting our stated values, theological values, personal commitments, generosity, right on down the line. And we may work, whether it's our profession or not, work toward those commitments to generosity, and we may even have an effect. I happen to believe we do, especially when we're collectives. Other thoughts about this whole business of providence and how we think about God in the world. Pat?
So first of all, I have to share with all of you that right before Christmas, Allison Katsofrakis, one of our confirmation teachers, had a really good conversation with our middle school kids. And one of the questions that they came up with that they would love to know about is, if God is in charge and created everything, then why did God create such imperfect people? Couldn't God have gotten it right the first time?
Yes.
Which is a good question. The other thing that I would propose is with the whole idea of providence. One of the challenges in the environmental movement, especially trying to engage communities of faith, is that there are a significant number of people of Christian persuasion who think that life on earth is horrible and someday we're all going to go somewhere else. And so why bother with this planet? And in fact, the faster we get rid of this one, the faster we'll all be happy. And so, no, you don't need to take care of it. You don't need to, because God's in control. And God's going to take us all someplace wonderful. One of the great gifts that I think Dr. Mark Brocker brought us was a realization that this is going to be our eternal home.
Coming home to earth.
Coming home to earth.
The title of his book, yeah.
Coming home to earth. And that, no, this is not ours to take advantage of and everything. This is where we're going to be living forever. And if we could ever get our act together and make it the way God intended, that we'd all be a lot happier.
Thanks, Pat. Appropriate ideas. Gretchen.
My thought is that any of you who have raised children know that you can't just tell them, do this, and they'll do it. Sometimes they have to have it explained. Sometimes they have to experience the consequences. And I don't know how God is dealing with this, but I suspect that's at least a little bit of it.
Yeah. Thanks, Gretchen. Good. Here you go, Ruth.
I think we have a tendency as human beings to imagine God as a being, a human being. And so we can look to this guy in the sky to solve our problems. And I want to suggest that God is a verb, not a noun. A verb.
A verb.
A being, a moving process that as we live, we come to understand in more and more different ways.
I think that's an important point, and one that I personally would want to affirm and agree with. Exactly. That it's dynamic, personally and communally, in communities of faith. And not just Christian communities, Jewish communities and Muslim communities, Buddhist communities. We can name them all. Thank you, Ruth. Okay, let's look for a moment at number 6. Kingdom on the right and kingdom on the left. I had a really good friend, colleague of mine, a philosopher. Came out of the Dutch Reformed tradition. Went to the University of Chicago, a hotbed of analytical philosophy, Anglo-analytic philosophy. I'm not going to elaborate what that is. But he would want to say to me and others that the Lutheran notion of the kingdom on the right and the kingdom on the left is basically a fuzzy, indistinct concept and makes no sense. Well, you know, and I was more of a junior faculty member. I was younger than he, and not younger, but more recent than he. And I thought, oh, okay, I'll just sit and listen to this. Maybe he's right. But now, those of you who know church history know that the Reformed Church, that is, the Dutch Reformed, Presbyterians, Swiss Reformed, they come out of the John Calvin tradition of the Reformation. And you know that Luther was an earlier contemporary of John Calvin. And Luther got himself into trouble later on in life because he didn't defend the peasant in the peasant revolt. And he was chastised severely by that, and probably rightly so. And Luther thought of this, the civic realm, the earthly realm, the kingdom on the left, kingdom on the right. There's a difference between what goes on here on earth in terms of governance and the kingdoms as opposed to the kingdom of God. And so what he wanted to argue, I think, unlike John Calvin, and Luther was not a systematic thinker, he was a reformer, and he could use really over-the-top language against his opponents. John Calvin was a much more systematic thinker. And Luther wanted to argue about these two separate, not totally detached or disconnected kingdoms, the kingdom here and the kingdom of heaven. They intersect as circles to a little extent, but they should not be overlapped. John Calvin came along and he wanted to create a Christian Geneva. A Christian city-state, if you will. Strike any of you as pretty contemporary, those who want to have a Christian America? Even if that were possible, and it's not, I wouldn't want it. I wouldn't want to live in that kind of place. So, how do we think about where we live, how we live, and how do we, in this tradition, want to think about and resist the idea that this is should be a white Christian nation? I think religions always get into trouble when they become the governing authorities. Look at Shiite Iran. I can't imagine that Allah is thrilled by what's going on in Tehran and the rest of the country. I can't imagine that Yahweh is exactly thrilled by what's going on in Gaza. I can't imagine that the God of the Christian community was thrilled a generation or two back by what was going on in Northern Ireland, let alone all the other less than . great episodes of degradation of the Christian message and affronts to the Christian God. Or maybe on the streets of Minneapolis. That's not to argue against law enforcement. It's a tough job if you want to do it right. It's not a tough job if you want to be an out-of-control thug. But I, for one, yes, Greg.
Thank you. One thing that I've been wondering about in a few points during the talks that you've had thus far, but it seems like before you get too much further on this kingdom of the right versus kingdom of the left, I want to ask an explicit question about, in our own theological instruction set, we are admonished to be in the world but not of it. Can you offer any thoughts on how that fits, I guess, with the kingdom of the left, right versus the kingdom of the left concept?
I think that's a really good and appropriate question. I mean, we do have, those biblical texts, be in the world but not of it, about do we pay taxes to Caesar or not? What is it, Paul's letter in Romans 13 is writing to the Roman Christians, and it probably has to do with paying taxes there as well. And I know that text was misused, and Paul, in that text, counsels obeying the duly not duly elected, but the imperial authorities, because they are of God, agents of God. Well, and I know that text was greatly misused by the white South Africans during the period of apartheid. And I don't think we like the result of that very much. So how should we think about it? Well, let's begin on a personal level, just each of us, as we're trying to wend our way through that kind of thicket. I think what we want to do is to imagine as best we can the consequences of one extreme or another. And that's kind of a consequentialist notion of ethics. How does it play itself out, and how has, from history, it played itself out, and are we willing to stand up publicly and defend that when you have states that have misused and abused their citizens. And on the other hand, how do we hold the kingdoms of this world as important and cherished and so on and so forth? You know, I think I'm kind of getting lost out here in your question, but I think it's a struggle. I think we need to do this. My friend who was the philosopher and kind of poo-pooed the whole notion of the two kingdoms, and finally I got to the point of just saying, look, I don't think any of this is hardwired into the world. I think it's the way we think about the world. That there are distinctions and separations to be made. But we may pay our taxes for important things that governments, state, federal, county, whatever, do. And some of which goes to providing law and order. It's good. But I, for one, cannot get to the idea that we should mandate a particular religion as being the state religion or church, when we know there are a whole lot of folks in this country who by tradition are not part of that, don't want to be part of that, and they're as much citizens as we are and should be treated accordingly. And if you don't do that, do we end up with a result, a consequence, that is just inimical to the tradition which we claim to represent? Then we gather in communities to think about the collective implications of this. We learn, we study. We join congregations, or synagogues or whatever. Am I making any progress on this? This is not a simple question. There's no simple answer to an important question. So I'm inclined to look at history, to think about consequences if we go this route or that route. Maybe that's, at least today, the best I can do. Others may have I know our time is about up here, but Lynn, I'll just give you this one then. Here, okay? I may need it back to.
In answer to the being in this world but not of this world, my gut feeling, which is not theologically informed, is that means we need to act on our values that are of the church. And that may mean going out to protest what's happening with ICE. It may mean giving money to those causes that are near and dear. It may mean putting our occupations or our reputations on the line to protest injustice. But it doesn't mean creating a Christian state. It means living out to the best of our ability what our beliefs are.
Well said, Lynn. Well said. Concluding comment is, I think I was leaning to the side of being a sinner rather than a saint. When in the middle of the night I was awake, and as many of you know, Julie and I lived in Minnesota for a lot of years. But it occurred to me in the middle of the night, and I had seen the news, it was really cold in Minneapolis. You realize what a flawed creature I am. But it occurred, if I were Governor Tim Walz, I think I know what I would do. I'd get the Minnesota DNR, Department of Natural Resources, and get their tanker planes and fly over them and douse them with water. Now, this has some real resonance to us because 20 years ago, we were at our place in Montana and there was a forest fire. And lo and behold, the Minnesota DNR planes were flying, and they would come around and later in the afternoon usually and say, okay, at 5 o'clock, the planes are going to fly over, stay inside, and they're going to douse this whole area. And they did. Plane after plane coming over, treetops, water flying. And I thought, oh, maybe some of our Minnesota state income tax is helping us out here in Montana. Now, I woke up chuckling at myself in the morning about how ridiculous would we want to do that? I don't think so. Thank you for coming today. And
The lakes are frozen, so you can't get the water from the lakes.
they may have to land and take off with it. Yeah, it's not as easy as it might suggest or as desirable. But I did hear that some of the ice people were complaining because people were throwing water out there and they were slipping around. And the person said, well, it's Minnesota in the winter. We all do that. Thanks so much for coming. Appreciate your time and attention, and we'll gather here next week and pick up my list.